Hey, this week we wanted to continue our conversation about racism that Andrew started for us last week. He talked about different facets of racism, so particularly aspects of the history that we tend not to know. And then we had a conversation about what we could do about it, and we wanted to get more specific and more concrete about that today. So I would really like for us to come up with some concrete things that each of us can do when we get into the conversation, when we finish that up. But first, I want to say a couple of little things quickly before we get started. The first one is a sort of warning. I'm not sure that I need to give it to anybody in this group in particular, but I think it's a good thing to mention. As humanists, particularly many of us that aren't religious, that don't believe in God or something like that, I think it's really important for us to make sure that during these conversations, we don't make this about us. I have certainly been in many conversations that often, evoke God and religion and things in ways that I find sort of exclusionary or objectionable, but that's not the subject. And so it's important to be able to step out of the limelight and say, look, this isn't about us. Normally, as humans, what we can do in context, lead more by a positive example, right, than we can by being critical. If we want to say, don't do this, don't, and so on, that can often be put people off rather than actually help. So I just wanted to mention that. I wouldn't expect anyone here, but I thought that's an important feature to mention. Now, when we're going to talk about what we can do about racism, I think people often leap to that position. They say, do this, do that. I was watching the Mayor's Forum the other day, and lots of people had solutions that they wanted to propose one way or another. Some of them, I think, had spent years thinking about this and considering these different things. Other people there seem a little more impulsive. When you see the comments they're all on there. The thing about every solution is that it implies a diagnosis of the problem. You have it somewhere thought about and said, here's the nature of the problem, right? And therefore, this is the solution. Except we're rarely that careful and explicit. Right. We typically just say people need to do this. We need to change the police this way. We need to have people get together and talk more or whatever, right, we will say we want to say. So I think it's often helpful when you feel yourself drawn to a solution to stop and back up and say, what diagnosis of the problem does this solution assume? And then we can check and see if that's really the case. Many of these solutions are presented as though they're magic bullets. These are the sentences that start, people just need to do this, right? And then the problem will go away. Often, though, these proposals have been tried in one way or another, and they didn't work. Racism just came back. It reasserted itself in a different way, in a different form, in a different place. So I doubt that there's going to be a magic bullet. I doubt there's going to be one thing that we can do. And I think that often drives people to feel very frustrated and powerless. Like, what can we do about racism? If I do this one thing, it just comes back. Is there another one thing I can do? Well, that's probably not the case. There's lots of different things. And the reason for that is that there's a common distinction made between structural or systemic racism and personal racism. And I think most of you know this. It's pretty common these days. Structural or systemic racism looks at the way the system works. It generally looks at outcomes and looks at inequalities then in those outcomes. So if we look at different incarceration rates, we're looking at the system, right? It doesn't necessarily say why those different incarceration rates exist. That's not the focus of structural racism. It's looking at what those differences are. You look at different health outcomes, right? And you say, okay, there's a racial disparity there. That's structural racism in that case, right? There's something going on back there that's producing that. It's systemic when they interact with each other in order to produce it in that way. That is when discrimination in education produces poverty, produces bad health outcomes, produces other areas and so on, right? They're interacting with each other. Personal racism focuses on flaws within individuals, right? So the model, of course, is racial hatred, right? Where somebody hates someone else because of their race. And that certainly exists in many cases. Inferiorization is another common one, right? Where somebody thinks people of other races are inferior. I think those are both sort of big, broad examples. I think there are a lot more examples that fit in here that are extremely common. Things like racial ignorance, where people just don't know about each other's backgrounds, histories, experiences. They might be willing to care if they did know about it, but because the way the world has worked and the way they've been educated, the systems, right, that they're within, they're ignorant. That's a flaw that they have. I think the truth is, if any of us are honest, we're all racially ignorant to different degrees. Some areas we may know better, some particular racial situations we may know better than others, but we all have areas of ignorance that can be part of that. And I think there can be a lot of other little vices, problems with the individual. The thing is that structural racism and personal racism interact to support each other. So if I am racially ignorant about how, another group's history, their interactions, how they've experienced the world, I can find interacting with them stressful or difficult. And if the structure is set up in such a way that I don't have to interact with them very often, I may never deal with that difficulty. I may never alter the way that I see the world. I may never come to understand them. So the structure might help reinforce some basic ignorance that I already had there. But even if I overcome that ignorance, like I learned something, right, and I'm comfortable in those situations, if the structure continues to push it so that I don't typically interact with people from those backgrounds, then I'm going to become increasingly uncomfortable in those circumstances and kind of avoid them and not connect to them and fall back into that same pattern. So changing just one part, just changing my mind or just changing the way people interact or something like that is unlikely to produce complete change. So I think that's a useful structure for me to think about and say, we've got to change both ourselves personally and the structures that we're interacting with to be able to overcome this problem. If we just change one or the other, they'll just reinforce each other. Things will just go back to the way they were. Okay, so with that structure and those basic ideas, I'm going to stop the recording and shift over to our conversation. Like I said, I want to talk about concrete things each of us can do. We're not all in the same city. We're not all in the same community. But I do want to talk about concrete ideas about what each of us can do to overcome racism.